Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to Working Rangelands Wednesdays, where we explore topics around rangeland agriculture in California and throughout the West. My name is Dan Macon. I'm a livestock and natural resources advisor with UC Cooperative Extension in Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties.
I'm Leslie Roach, a cooperative extension specialist in rangeland science and management with the University of California, Davis.
And my name is Grace Woodmancy. I'm a grad student at UC Davis, and Dan and Leslie are my advisors.
We want to let everybody know that we are recording this webinar, and it will be posted later on our UC Rangelands YouTube channel. If you are a live participant and want to ask a question, we'd ask that you use the chat or the Q&A pods to type your questions in. We'll keep an eye on those, and we'll have time in the last part of the hour for follow-up questions. And I should also say that this is just the latest in a series of webinars that we've been doing for the last month and a half or 2 months, largely focused around the topics of drought on rangeland. And today we're going to cover the challenges of coping with drought on publicly owned rangeland. This is funded in part through a grant from the Renewable Resources Extension Act, and we're really happy to have you all here today. So to introduce our panel, I want to start with putting this in context just a little bit. We've talked in previous webinars about the fact that rangeland livestock producers are often the first to feel the effects of drought. And certainly producers who operate on public land, whether it's local, state, or federal, are no different. We're also, because of where California is and because of how different our climate is than the rest of the West, often challenged by inability to get real-time information about drought conditions. The drought monitor doesn't always reflect on-the-ground conditions in California. And that's important for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that it impacts producers' ability to access insurance and assistance programs. And I think we'll get into that a little bit today. But first, I want to introduce our panelists. We have Jack Hanson, who is a family rancher from Lassen County. They have a cow-calf operation that utilizes both private and public land. They operate on BLM land in the summertime in Lassen County, and they also operate on some state land in the Sierra foothills in the wintertime. Emilio Huarte, who has joined us by phone today, is out and about in the midst of moving sheep around, I think, is the second generation foreman for Talbot Sheep Company based in Los Banos, California. And Emilio manages several bands of sheep that spend time on BLM land in western Nevada near Virginia City in the springtime, and then summers on the Tahoe National Forest north of Truckee in the summertime. And our last panelist is Tim Koopmann, who has a family cow-calf operation in the Bay Area, multi-generation operation. And they operate, in addition to their private land, on a variety of leased land from local agencies, municipalities, and a variety of other nonprofit landowners. And so we'll really get into kind of the differences and similarities between how we cope with drought on public versus private land. So Jack, I think I'll start with you with this first question. Could you tell us a little bit about the public lands that you graze and how they fit into your annual forage calendar? You're on mute, Jack.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the reminder. Anyway, thank you very much for having me here today, and happy to be part of the panel discussion. As you mentioned, we got both BLM and Cal Fish and Wildlife properties that we graze on. The Bureau of Land Management property is immediately adjacent to the home ranch here in Lassen County. Starts at about 5,000 feet in elevation, runs up to 8,000. It's mostly sagebrush and juniper, obviously. Juniper up here, obviously, is considered a weed. And so we try to eliminate it, but it's mostly sagebrush country, annual and perennial grasses. The permit actually starts on 1 April. We, however, don't go out until about the 1st of May. 1st of May being the time frame that we return from the Sacramento Valley with most of the cows that go out there. The cows go out, we wean the calves when they come off the truck out of the Sacramento Valley. The cows go out there dry, and they'll graze out there. They can graze out till the 1st of September or 30 August. However, mostly because of the drought conditions that we've experienced over the past 10 years off and on, they'll usually end up coming home around the 1st of July, or pardon me, the 1st of August. This year, however, it's been even earlier. We've had an extremely dry spring and early summer. Not only have we had a lack of moisture, lack of rain, but it's been combined with a lot of wind and a lot of hot temperatures, just like everybody else is seeing. In fact, if global warming, I know Tim has something to say about global warming, but if global warming were to continue, you never know, we might grow fruits and nuts and all the rest of those varied crops up here. But in Lassen County, primarily hay and cattle country. We, on our allotment, the South Horse Lake allotment, there's about 45,000 acres, and we run 100 and close to 200 cows out there for that time frame that I mentioned. In addition, we have Cal Fish and Wildlife lease down near Reno, Nevada, but back into the state of California. We utilize that in the summer, and then, as you said, we have 2 leases down in the Sacramento Valley, one in Browns Valley, and the other one down near Grass Valley, Rough and Ready, or Spencerville to be specific. So be happy to answer any questions when they may come up. It's generally a rundown of the properties that we run on.
Great, thank you, Jack. Emilio, and I would remind folks that Emilio is joining us by phone today, but Emilio, could you talk a little bit about the public lands that you graze and kind of how they fit into your overall schedule?
Yeah, Dan, thanks for having me. Thanks for being here, guys. What I call our sheep outfit is a migratory sheep outfit. We start breeding the ewes in mid part of May, and we breed them in the state of Nevada, which is BLM. We go just above Carson City there, Washoe Lake area. We start the breeding there. So, you know, on a dry year, breeding's not that great, but you know, on a green year, we make more twins. So from there, we go to the Forest Service, and they continue breeding on there. Basically, we're just chasing the green as we go, and that's up around Truckee, north of Truckee there on the Tahoe National Forest. And then we bring our ewes back down to Las Banas, lamb them in the alfalfa fields come November. And then after we leave the alfalfa fields, we take them to our local foothills just west of Las Banas here, and we finish them on BLM ground, which, well, it's about a 32,000 acre lease what we have up there. And we're able to run, you know, 4 good sized bands of sheep. And, you know, the last, between 2011 and 2015, we were only able to fit 2 bands of sheep up there. So it's, you know, it all depends on the rainfall. It just all, you know, it depends on how much rain we get. It depends on that tells us when we're going to ship our lambs. If it doesn't rain all winter long, we're not shipping lambs. You know, we're shipping lambs by end of February, 1st of March. We get more rainfall, we can make it till the 1st of April, and then we start the procedure all over again. So yeah, that's about a migratory sheep outfit, if you want to call it one.
And Emilio, just a quick follow-up question for folks that maybe aren't familiar with sheep. How many sheep are in a band? What are we talking about?
I have about 12 this year, Dan. You were there. I got 1,220 ewes each band this year, and I got 2 bands up in the Truckee Forest, and then I got a 3rd band of about 915 ewes. But I try not to go anything less than 900, and very seldom anything over 1,250.
All right, great, thank you. Tim, could you tell us a little bit about your public lands grazing and kind of how that fits with the rest of your operation?
All the land that we operate on is annual grasslands. We don't make the cows mobile. Our cow-calf operation, the cows run year-round on either the leased parcels or on the home ranch here. We do rotate individually within the leased parcels and the home ranch, but the cattle never get on a truck and go anywhere. They're subject to a good feed year if it rains and pretty dry conditions if it doesn't. We run several hundred cows together as a family. The leases we have include one municipal lease that was a part of a conservation easement give back to us. We also have the Santa Clara County Open Space Authority and the Santa Clara County Parks Department that we lease from. Tell you, if you got some waspy cows, and if you can get them through the first month or so, they sure settle down with mountain bikes and hikers through these parcels. That can be a problem, but they'll settle down, become pretty docile cows after a while. The other public land, it's not even really public, but it's an NGO called Save Mount Diablo. Save Mount Diablo historically has been anti-grazing, and they led the charge to take the grazing off the state park at Mount Diablo years ago. What their operation involves, this Save Mount Diablo, is they purchase available properties that could be added to the park through donations, and then they basically discount the properties and sell them to the state park system. State park system hasn't had money to make these purchases, so Save Mount Diablo at the present time owns about 10 parcels. We happen to lease one, it's about 1,000 acres, and they all of a sudden have decided that grazing as a management tool is a pretty essential thing for them. So it's been a really good thing for us to be able to, and I did a biological and rangeland assessment as a baseline when we first took the property, and I'm going to be more than willing to bring that to the state park system and say, okay, here's where we are, here's what our baseline was, how are you guys doing with no grazing? So I think we'll have some valuable information to share with them. Drought, as of right now, because we stay in place and we stay on these dry land hills and the cows summer there as well, we did not have one drop of runoff this past year. So if people relied on ponds to fill up, they're in dire straits right now in terms of having enough water to get to the winter months. Spring productivity has been limited because, once again, these springs did not restore because of the lack of runoff water we've had. So we've had an abundant feed year as far as forage availability. Until March rainfall, that was even looking pretty rough. But the March rains brought good feed, and there's a lot of places locally where there's feed, there's dry feed standing, but there's not enough water to support the cattle.
And Tim, that's a good segue, I think, to our second question about whether the impacts you see on public land are any different than you see on your private ground in terms of drought, or are they very similar?
You want me to just continue?
Yeah.
All right, I'll continue with the question, kind of out of order. I think that what we've run into with our lease properties is many times we're more inclined to invest in water development on our own properties. So we are less impacted by the drought situation because we have done some solar pump installation. We've done different things to enhance what water we've got at home here. What people run into when they're leasing from a public land agency is, first of all, how long is my lease going to last? Will it come to open bid, and will I lose it if I put a lot of investment into this infrastructure? The second thing is, who's going to pay for the infrastructure? These solar pumps, anywhere between $3,000 and $6,000. Storage tanks, plumbing and pipelines and things like that. It's not cheap to put these installations in, and to put them on a piece of leased property without getting assistance from NRCS or having the landowning agency participate through a rent credit program or something like that, it's sometimes difficult to do. Of course, many of these places that we've got have ponds that were constructed back in the 50s and 60s through the Soil Conservation Service. But many of them, the spillways are starting to deteriorate, and many of them are silted up, and so they don't serve the purpose they once did. Counting on these ponds as their primary water source, so it's becoming pretty hazardous to count on just ponds for these the primary water source. But unless you've got some help to put these infrastructure items in with the solar pumps and storage tanks and the pipelines, it's difficult to operate on some of these public lands during drought conditions.
Thank you, Tim. Emilio, what kinds of drought impacts do you see on your BLM or your Forest Service land, and how does that differ from what you might see down there at home in Los Banos?
Well, on the BLM, the biggest impact we have, especially in a drought, the lack of water up there is we have more wild horses that come in. Our biggest problem that we face up there are the wild mustangs, and where there's water, that's where the wild mustangs are going to be. And we're not allowed to push them off. But as far as trying to get the sheep and the horses to drink out of the same spring, it's damn near impossible. So we do a lot of water hauling. On a good wet year, we're not hauling any water in that country. But any kind of springs that are somewhat still alive up there, they'll get bombed out by the horses, and basically when we get to them, we can't use them. So that's one impact we see up there. And the stuff I go to over in Plumas, basically when it's dry, my tech will bring me problems, not solutions. And sometimes we're just not better going into that country. We learn to stay out of the country on a dry year, and sometimes we're better off just keeping them home locally in Los Banos rather than putting the freight on them, taking them up there, because every time you have to go haul water down, it's expensive. And we do a lot of water hauling in the BLM country. The Forest Service country we have in Truckee it's not bad at all. And we make do there, but the BLM, our biggest impact is the wild horses, the damage that they're doing to the springs, and the following year they're all bombed out and we can't use them.
If you can't go to those public lands, is it a scramble to find feed there at home and keep sheep at home?
More and more now. Here in the San Joaquin Valley, it's hard for us to find summer feed for sheep. We have a lot of almond trees that have been planted. Used to be a lot of grain fields, a lot of alfalfa fields. So yes, it is getting harder. And basically when we were in the drought from 2011 to 2015, a Forest Service came to me and told me that they needed me to cut back sheep numbers. Well, it's easy to cut back your numbers. You just don't replace them every year. You cut your numbers back. But once the drought lifted, they told me in 2017, by 2019, they'd like to have me up to another 1,000 head of sheep. Well, what would happen if 2020 and 21 were another drought year and I got 1,000 sheep, and then you're going to tell me I can't come in with that extra 1,000 head of sheep or, get back up to my original numbers? It's complicated. I mean, sometimes I'm better off keeping my numbers low to where I have more country than I have sheep. I mean, it's a little more costly, but it gets frustrating.
And Jack, how about you? What kinds of impacts do you see from drought on your public land, and how does that differ from private ground?
Well, certainly, Dan, the stockwater issue, Emilio talked about it, Tim talked about it, and that'd be our issue. With the March rains and so on, if we were to reflect on just this past year anyway, we got a pretty good green up out in the outside country, the BLM country. Obviously, a lot of that is cheatgrass, and that's an annual that we don't all love. And it matured pretty short this year, at least in our country. But stockwater is the driving issue for us as well. We've got a pretty good county road going through the permit, so we can put troughs out. However, we had 2 fires this last year, and as Emilio knows, I mean, once you have a fire, you got to stay off it for a while. So we really don't have access to the county road for putting out water troughs. It's an interesting thing when your permit is right outside the home ranch, right outside the gate. For real estate brochures and everything else, that sounds so great. Well, it's great, except the fact that the cattle know exactly how to get home. And we had a pretty good turnout this year. In fact, we almost do every year. We'll have enough feed out there to turn a full complement of cows out. We'll fully utilize our AUMs out there. But the problem is during a drought, they come home early. And I know part of the question you had was the difference between private and public. And obviously our private ground is all irrigated. If you didn't have irrigated ground in Lassen County, you don't have anything during the summer months. So the difference between the outside country and the irrigated ground is fairly pronounced. As far as the leases down in the valley, the Cal Fish and Wildlife leases down in the valley, again, we had pretty good feed. Stock water became the issue, and that's been the driving issue.
We lost that last part there, Jack. What was the driving issue?
The driving issue is stock water.
Okay.
Pretty much, at least for our operation. As Tim said, we've got the EQIP program up here that's fairly good at doing some things out on the BLM properties. USDA and BLM work pretty closely together, mostly through the Sagegrass Initiative, and we haven't mentioned the sagegrass yet, but maybe we'll get to it a little later on. But we can get some EQIP money out there on our allotments, and that's helped a bit. But as Tim said, the supplying and putting in a well, firstly you got to find the water, and that's a challenge out in the country. But anyway, stock water was the issue for us.
And Jack, just a question of clarification for you. Because the cattle are on outside ground in the summertime, does that allow you to cut some hay on the home ranch?
That's correct.
Well,
yeah,
okay.
We'll bring them in on the aftermath. And of course, this year we're cutting a little bit less hay on the inside. The cows are coming home earlier, as I mentioned. We probably got at least 80% of the cows are home right now, and we're just barely into the month of July, first half of July. So we've got a plan for a little bit extra feed on the ranch. But yeah, no, it obviously. The allotment and public lands grazing up in Lassen County, I mean, there's no doubt it's a real benefit. It's a bit of a cost savings, gives us all a lot more flexibility. There aren't many vacant allotments up here. But especially that would be especially true on BLM. Forest Service, there are a few more vacant allotments because of a variety of issues out in the forest. But
thank you. Emilio, we had talked a little bit about this before we got started, but I want to kind of turn now to working with the agencies and how the folks that you work with at BLM and Forest Service respond to drought, but maybe step back from that a bit too and talk about continuity. Over the course of your career, how many different range cons have you worked with on the Tahoe National Forest?
5 since 2007. Prior to that, Ray was more in charge. I was more in the truck, but since I've taken over since 2007, yeah, it's been 5. And this year will be number 6. And I've had good luck with everybody there. They've been pleasant to work with. Not all offices are the same, but I've had pretty good luck there. They're the type of people that, they may bring you a problem, but they're going to help you find a solution. So, there's, like I said, every office is different though.
When it comes to drought, what are some of the things that they come and ask you to do if it's going to be dry conditions? What are they likely to ask for?
First thing they'll ask me to do is cut back on numbers. And that's one of those times I tell you, well, they'll come to you with a problem, but they don't help you find the solution. If you're running 3,300 sheep out on the forest and they tell you have to cut one band back, it's difficult to find feed for 1,100 head of sheep. And not that they're giving you plenty of notice, I guess you should say, but not enough notice for a sheep man or a cattleman, because it's pretty easy to. You could sell 1,100 head of sheep, but then when you want to build those numbers back up, it takes some time. So that's one of my biggest heartaches with it, I guess you should say. So that first thing they'll do is tell you to cut back, and then there's certain allotments that they'll want you to stay off of because they're too dry. But like I said, where we run our sheep now, You know, we're running 3,300 ewes, and 25 years ago they were running over 6,000 head on the same allotments. So things have changed. They've cut back numbers on us and made them permanent AUMs to where they're staying that way now. But we never step on the same country twice.
Tim, how about you? How do the agency folks that you work with kind of respond to drought and try to work with you?
Well, I think first of all, I'd like to state that the most important thing that you as a tenant can do is to make sure that you and the landowner's agent have a complete understanding of what happens during a drought and have that memorialized in a lease document. That saves a lot of heartache down the road. A lot of times it isn't in a written lease, but dealing with public agencies, they usually demand about a 50-page attorney-approved lease, so you can work with that. To work with that agent that's representing the landowner, I can't emphasize enough having them have an understanding of the business we're in, to understand the economics, to understand that we can't just, as I quote Lynn Hunsinger, you can't just put a cow on a shelf when you don't need them. And that if they demand an immediate removal or reduction in head counts, it's a real business disruption if you have to take those cows with a 10-day notice or a 15-day notice and find a home for them. You're probably not going to find a home for them because the rest of the state's going to be suffering as well. So to put them on a market with a bunch of other cows flooding the market, you get hurt. So that's a business disruption. Start with a lease document that fits you and fits their needs. Make sure everybody understands the business of what we do. Make sure they understand that we have a reasonable expectation of a profit. So that's not a cuss word. And also an understanding of the logistics of moving cattle and marketing cattle. In this age of climate change, we may be, and basically it's just weather change, but climate change, we're entering into a drier period. Gee, Christmas, we've done that before. And with climate change, there could be more strain on these leases, more strain on our water sources. So make sure you have a business plan. Make sure that the agency understands the business plan. Make sure that they can give you or are required to give you a notice of intent to reduce numbers and how many days they give you to do that. Most importantly, sit down with the primary person you're dealing with, that front person, and become a partner with that person. Become a partner with that agency so that they understand what your needs are, you understand what their goals are, and work together on drought solutions.
I think that's really good advice, Tim. And I think that may be one of the differences to some extent in local or state public lands versus some of the federal lands issues that we deal with. Jack, I'd wonder if you could kind of talk about your experience having both state and federal lands, about how those agencies deal with drought and how you interact with them.
Sure, Dan. Might as well start with the federal agency and the Bureau of Land Management specifically. We are blessed with a very good office here in the Eagle Lake District, and have a great working relationship, if you will, with not only the range cons, but the rest of the personnel, wildlife biologists, and everybody else within the office. And I can't say enough for at least pretty much California BLM, but most specifically the Eagle Lake District. That's the one I'm most familiar with. As far as the issue of drought and turnout and bringing animals home and so on, you know, for us, it's kind of what's good for the cow is good for the land. I mean, if you got a bunch of starving cows out there and a bunch of land without anything on it, that's not good for either party. So I'll be honest with you, in my 30 years here, 30 plus years, pardon me, in Lassen County, I've had 2 range cons, and they've never told us to get off the property. So And that might be an anomaly. That probably isn't necessarily the standard, if you will, on a lot of the federal lands. But again, we've got a very good relationship. The relationship with the state's a little bit different. Tim talked about the size of contracts. The size of the contract with the state of California for a grazing lease, and there are 5-year leases. The size of the contract is fairly large. Some of them require you to have a management plan, and that management plan that you present during the bidding process is taken into consideration as they're going through and awarding a grazing lease. And then some don't have a management plan required. You pretty much just work with the personnel on the ground and work out your differences, if you will, or work out a manageable and workable solution to things. But I honestly don't have a lot of complaint about the state as well. The folks responsible, I can't call them range cons because they're not necessarily range cons. I find that the state people don't know quite as much about the livestock industry and cattle grazing. I mean, it's kind of new for them to go ahead and issue some of these leases that we've seen out there. As many would know, 10 years ago, we had quite a few grazing leases on some state properties, and then all of a sudden they pulled the plug on them, pulled everything back, and now we're slowly getting back into wildlife areas and some of the other state lands. And I certainly applaud them for that effort to go ahead and graze these properties. Obviously, fuel reduction is a big consideration on their part. This isn't a drought comment, Dan, but the fuel reduction issue, it's kind of a two-edged sword for livestock operators. We like to leave, especially we're talking about the Sacramento Valley, the winter feed situation more specifically. We like to leave a little bit of residue back there so that the cows have something to come to before the grass really greens up in the spring. And, for fuel reduction purposes and fire purposes, they sometimes like us to eat that down a little bit further than we would like to for our management. Again, as Tim said, it's just hopefully everybody understanding each party's needs and being able to work the middle ground on these things. And so far, we've been able to do that. But again, with the BLM, the kids now who work for BLM, they all went to school here with our kids, and we're very fortunate to have a good local staff with BLM.
Tim, I saw you nodding to the kind of the tension between fall feed and fuel reduction. That's something a lot of us grapple with. That may be subject for a future webinar, but what's your experience with that question?
It could very well lead to another webinar, because saving fall feed is tremendously important for those of us on the annual grasslands as well. And there are a number of practices that we would like to be able to participate in. One of them would be invasive weed management, where fire is the best tool, and burning up your fall feed in order to battle barb goat grass or medusa head or something like that. Not too many of us are in a position where we want to do that, because we then don't have the fall feed to come back to. But yeah, it's an issue. And a lot of times the RDM values that the agencies want are in excess of what I would consider to be adequate grazing, and you end up with bare ground that we don't want to see. We end up with encouraging noxious invasive weeds, because many times you've heavily grazed something that you normally wouldn't have, but their goal may be fine fuel load suppression. So it can be an issue.
I think that definitely could be a future topic. So stay tuned. Jack, I wonder if you could kind of walk us through, we talked a little bit about impacts, but what are some of the strategies that you use once drought is hit? And do you use different strategies depending on whether it's on private or public land, or is it kind of all one big toolbox for you?
The one big toolbox is probably correct. And obviously, if you're trying to make plans for reduction in feed in some areas that you may use, and and then you've got to, maybe have a little bit of extra elsewhere. For us, a couple of the things that we do in order to maybe adjust our feed demands, if you will. As I mentioned earlier, yes, we do put up pay on the home ranch. If we have a shortage of feed in the outside country, which we have this summer, we'll put up less hay. We may we run our calves kind of 2 seasons sometimes, so we'll be grazing calves in the summer and or feeding them in the winter, but that would be rare. But we'd be grazing them during the summer months. We can liquidate those calves or move those calves a little bit earlier and be able to make room for the mother cow on some of the property. Those would probably be the primary issues we've had. There are a couple of programs you mentioned a little bit earlier, the Drought Monitor and LFP and PRF, which is our rain and hail insurance that we can take out that is subsidized by the federal government. Those are probably 2 other things that we can do to help, at least from a financial standpoint, tackle a drought issue. Gosh knows we can always buy more hay. It might be very expensive and cost prohibitive, but you can do that. Reducing cow numbers is one thing we try to avoid. We have a closed herd. We raise our own replacements. We don't buy any outside cattle. And so consequently, and that has a couple of advantages. I mean, one, with the vertically integrated marketing program we have, that's a big help there. But then secondly, your cows know the country. And you buy some strange cows and put them on a strange piece of country, it's going to take them a year or 2 to figure it out. So reducing cow numbers is not a response that we normally take. We'll do a lot of things before we do that.
Emilio, how about you? I've watched some of your sheep in the high country, and they sure seem to know that piece of ground too. What are the tools in your toolbox for dealing with drought?
The first thing I learned when we had this last drought, was I make my band smaller. Rather than have them 1,200, 3 bands of 1,200 or 3 bands of 1,100, I'll make 4 bands of 800. It's a little more expensive that way. You got more labor involved. But as you know, with the Forest Service in Truckee, I turn in GPS coordinates every week. So that way they know where the sheep are at. They know where the herders are camped. And, earlier I said one of the first things they do is they'll say cut back on numbers. Well, Brianne, the last gal I had working with us, that's where we came up with the idea together. Okay, let's make, rather than 3 bands, let's do 4, make small, and work it that way. It seems to be working when we have enough sheep to do it. But they want us to move quicker and farther along on a dry year rather than a wet year. They'll let us take a little more longer. And how they keep track of us, like I said, we turn in our GPS coordinates once a week, showing where the animals are at and where we're moving to. And they'll ask, hey, can we move along a little bit quicker? Or can we stay a little bit longer in this area rather than this area? So, we work together on the deal, and it seems to be working out okay.
Just a follow-up question for you, Emilio, is if you split 3 bands into 4, what are the costs associated with that? Does that make it more expensive to have them in the mountains?
Yeah, well, it does, because you're going to have an extra herder involved, right. And the labor in California is not cheap. So, even for a Peruvian sheep herder, it's coming from Peru, you're adding another $3,000 a month, just for that extra band of sheep of 800 ewes. So it's not cheap, and there might be extra transportation because you're going to a different part of the allotment. There's a few more added costs to it, but it's more the labor than anything.
Tim, how about you? What are the tools in your toolbox, and is there any difference between public and private ground in using those?
Well, I believe we've handled the drought on the home ranch here differently than we do on the private lands. Thankfully, what we've been able to do locally is to get many of our public lands available converted from a cash rent per acre to AUMs. And the advantage to that certainly is that if you have a catastrophic fire, if you have drought conditions, you only pay for what you use. So our strategy has been to take if we have drought conditions and forage resources are low and or water is low, bring the cows home. And if you're going to try to dry lot them or feed them at home, at least do it at home. And then you're not losing the money on trying to leave them on an overgrazed public lands allotment, because you're not gaining anything there. And if you're on an AUM basis, that way you pay for what you use. So getting a lot of these leases converted to AUMs as opposed to cash rent. Cash rent used to be predominant here. And when you had an open oral auction bid for some of these properties, cash rent was what they demanded. But converting to an AUM system, if it's supposed to run 100 cows and you've got to take 50 of them out of there, you only pay for the remaining 50 cows that are on that property on an AUM basis. So that's been good. Then if you do have to do dry lotting or feeding, then you can bring them home and then make some business decisions, and you kind of buy yourself a little time that way without having that public land agency be on you all the time about lighten it up, lighten it up. So that's the strategy we've kind of used. Try to convert all the leases to AUM basis and then do the feeding at home. Hopefully you might have left one field with extra forage that you can come back to and then feed on that one field.
Well, we're kind of on to our last question now, and it really dovetails with that, Tim. I think, looking back in our grazing operation, I kind of assumed that the drought of 2011 to 2015 was going to be the toughest stretch of time that we went through. Seems kind of silly to say that now that we're in 2020, but that last drought definitely seemed significant. Looking back at that drought, Tim, what are the main lessons that you took away, and what would you do differently than you did back then?
Well, I think I kind of outlined them in the previous question, because we did, since that time, we worked on two of our permits, our licenses, to get them converted to AUMs. And I think that was an important move to get accomplished. The 2011-2015 drought, I think, was devastating for everybody. We did bring cows home, and we adopted the strategy I talked about in the previous question. During this time period, about halfway through the drought period, we finally got things where we lined up and could do that. Then it gives you some time to make some strategic business plans too. If you're going to go ahead and reduce some numbers, you've got them at home and you can reduce numbers and go to town with the cattle. But again, to go back with what we will do and what we are working on right now is also to try to encourage these public land agencies to lengthen the amount of years on that lease, to encourage us to help to work on some water development, to work on some rent credit policies, etc., so that they will cost share and help you with that. So I think development of water resources is extremely important, and that goes along with, I'm willing to invest $20,000 in a solar pump and a setup if I know I've got a 10-year lease or a 15-year lease or a 10-year lease with 2 5-year options. I'm more willing to go ahead and invest that money if I know I'm going to be there for a while. So these are the kinds of things that I think are important in working with the land agency itself. Again, it goes back to having them understand your business, understand that a long-term lease is beneficial because you kind of then take an ownership interest in that property and you become a partner with the landowner.
That's a great point. Great point. Emilio, what were the main lessons that you took away from 2011 to 2015? And would you do anything differently today looking back on that experience?
I'll always be prepared. Every year going into a new year, I just prepare myself like it's going to be a drought year. So always have a water truck that's running. Always have a water truck with gas in it. It was, like everybody said, it was an experience I'd never been through, and it was devastating. But since then, I've learned to, develop a good relationship with my BLM rep, and they're good to us in Carson City. And not only that, it's just always be good to your neighbors, because they may help you out with a little bit of water.
Tim, you had your hand in the air. Were you going to add something
Yeah.
to that?
I just wanted to mention Miller Lux Ranches, and the philosophy over 100 years ago was to have 2 years worth of hay in the barns.
Okay.
So that would be another strategy. If you got an opportunity to buy some hay on a relatively decent market that's not going to bust you, put hay in the barns. Not grain hay. The mice love it.
Jack, how about you? What were the main takeaways for you from the drought, and what, if anything, would you do differently?
What I would have done different, I'll tell you one thing, I'd put more acres into PRF, I'll guarantee you. The rain and hail insurance is paid every year for us. So at any rate, that's been certainly a good way to deal with the drought. And if anybody out there isn't familiar with it, I mean, there are plenty of people advertising, selling it, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with it. The only thing I'd suggest is don't necessarily put your money on the square where you need the rain. Take a look at the odds and put them where the odds are best. But in addition to that, I mean, flexibility, Tim mentioned hay. You know, you've got to have some flexibility. You got to have a little in reserve. And then we eat into those reserves. And that's when it really starts to hurt, because, well, you know, you make it year after year, and it does become more difficult. I know that there was one question there, Dan. I looked at your Q&A while I was sitting here, and I see there's one question about the drought monitor, and the observation is exactly correct. And you had alluded to that earlier in the conversation, that the drought monitor doesn't exactly reflect the conditions on the ground. This year, for some reason, the drought monitor in Lassen County, it's been ridiculous, because we're substantially drier than we were even during a lot of the years between 11 and 15, to be quite honest with you. So at any rate, yeah, that's just something we've got to deal with. We've had the folks out from Nebraska. They've made presentations. Many of us in the area have gone to the comment section on the drought monitor, and for the last 2 months, virtually every week, we'll comment on the drought monitor. But that's an issue I would hope we could get rectified, and maybe they get a little bit more trusting. I don't know if trusting is the right word, but you know, start listening a little bit more to your ag commissioner and your extension agents and so on and so forth, not just the ranchers in the area. As far as, you know, what we've learned, as I said, just learn to be flexible, learn to have some alternatives out there. Some of your alternatives are good, some of them aren't, but at least, you know, go into it with somewhat of a plan and some alternatives that might work. So.
Great. Well, thank you all. I think that's a really good overview of some of the similarities, but also some of the differences between public and private land. I'm going to ask Grace and Leslie to rejoin us now, and I think Grace had a question perhaps to kick us off for all of you, and Grace, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Well, I was just wondering, since all of you mentioned kind of feeling the impacts of the 2020 drought, is there any research-based information that you wish you had this year to make decisions with?
Tim, you want to take the first crack at that?
As far as information available to us for the drought, there used to be a guy that had a website on Facebook that was really, really good. I think Dan Macon was his name, but he's kind of abandoned us on that.
I'll talk to him.
Oh, yeah.
You know what happened to that Facebook page?
I think we should have more ranchers posting on the Farmer Rancher Drought Forum now. I think that's a good point. Emilio, how about you? Is there any?
I commend you for what you did during it. I commend you, though, for what you did during those drought years. You were kind of a breath of fresh air, at least if nothing else, to give us all a chance to vent and commiserate with you and your dealings with the drought too. That was a good source of information. University of California Cooperative Extension is always good. Our NRCS folks always provide some information as well.
Emilio, anything that would be helpful to you to have in terms of information or research along these lines?
Yeah, I mean, if we got a news forecaster that could tell a 1-year forecast ahead of us, I'd be happy. But you know, it's just listen to your gut. I mean, listen to your instincts. If it's happened in the past, it'll happen again. It's just always be prepared. And I mean, the best preparation for it is just like they said, have plenty of hay stored up. And I've learned to do that.
Jack, how about you? Any kind of research-based information that you'd find helpful?
You know, Grace, it's an interesting question. That, you know, as far as information that would be immediately available that would help us deal with an ongoing drought, probably not. I agree with Tim. I think that between cooperative extension and NRCS and even within the agencies, we get pretty good information. So I can't think of anything, Dan, to be honest with you, additional information. Probably maybe if somebody could tell us where there are available leases and how we could bid on them and so on. Leases have become scarce and expensive. It'll be interesting to see as COVID-19 kind of works its way through the community, the livestock community, as to how these leases all shake out. I've noticed, I don't know about you, Tim, but I've noticed there are a few more becoming available, especially winter ground down in the Sacramento Valley, but nothing's cheap. You have to remember our BLM leases may run $1.30 to $1.50 an AUM, and for winter feed down there, it's all over the board, but $30 to $50 isn't uncommon. So,
Jack, is there a difference in the?
One of the things that I've noticed.
Go ahead, Tim.
Okay, one of the things that I've noticed too that's not a good reflection on our beef community or the grazing community itself is that we used to have a kind of a rule of thumb and code of the West, if you will, that if one of your fellow ranchers or producers had a lease, that nobody went behind their back to try to take that lease away from them. And I'm disgruntled and disappointed in the beef community or the grazing community by observing that doesn't always hold true anymore. And that code of the West has kind of disappeared in some areas where there is some what I call blatant backstabbing to take leases away from people that may have had them for years and years. That's bothersome in and of itself. And the willingness of people to pay for some of these leases, they might in fact have other sources of income and maybe looking at this grazing operation as a way to hide some income from another source. And they're willing to pay far more than you can make these leases work with a pencil to make them work out and be a viable part of an economic business plan. So these things are kind of bothering me here. And you talked about, you know, $30 to $50 an AUM for some of these leases, and on a cash rent per acre too. It's getting just outrageous in some case, bothersome to me. The code of the West doesn't appear to be sound.
I would tend to agree, Tim. I think that's a good observation. I mean, those that are from the agencies that are on an open bidding, obviously, you know, that's a fairly upfront way of doing it. And I don't, but yeah, there are some people come in and really cut your throat on a private lease sometimes.
Got one more question from a participant, but I want to ask Emilio one quick question because I think it does suggest perhaps some differences between cattle and sheep. And Emilio, do you find that you have some flexibility with putting your sheep places that maybe you couldn't put cattle? Is there some opportunities for sheep that don't exist for cattle producers?
No, definitely on that. There's a lot of opportunity out there for grazing, and, you know, as far as for grazing sheep. One thing about sheep, you know, we have, you've seen yourself, Dan, a lot of portable electric fencing, a lot of areas that, you know, there is no water there, but it can be hauled and, you know, the feed's out there as far as, you know, being able to graze sheep. And I think it's easier to come by for a sheep man than it is a cattleman. A lot of the infrastructure is just not there anymore. And we go in, we have portable infrastructure and we set it up. And when we're done, we take it with us. So, and that makes a big difference there. It's just, and you know, I go all through California and every area is different, but you know, you get up there in the Bay Area, there's a lot of areas up there where, you know, there's going to be houses on hilltops, but you got a 400-acre canyon in between these houses on this side of the canyon and those houses on that side of the canyon. And, you know, there's a lot of grazing in between there, and a lot of that we do. And, you know, it's just a lot of places that a cattleman wouldn't be able to get into.
And that's a good preview for our webinar in 2 weeks, I think, too. One last question for all three of you. What can the agencies do to provide more flexibility? Are there some things that you haven't mentioned already that you think would be helpful?
I don't mind taking that a little bit, but you know, with BLM, I think, again, most of the employees that we deal with have a pretty good working knowledge of grazing and, you know, kind of what the cattle do and what's good and what's not. I think with the state agencies, as they, you know, continue to have more grazing leases out there and so on, a better understanding by most of them, not only, as Tim pointed out earlier, a better understanding, not necessarily the cow, but understanding the economics and what's possible. On one grazing lease, Dan, that you're familiar with, they want to get rid of star thistle, so they want us to graze it forever. And as Tim pointed out, you go after a noxious weed, you're going to kill the good grasses in a lot of instances. In another instance, they want us to get rid of cheatgrass on a burn area, and there's no flexibility in the numbers. We have the same number on the cheatgrass that we're allowed to have on the inside, or the irrigated pastures and so on. If you really want to hit that cheatgrass and get rid of it, you only have a couple of week window. You got to treat it differently. So if the agencies could understand the economics and the way cattle and or sheep work, I think that'd be a good deal.
Emilio, how about you? Anything that would be helpful in terms of flexibility?
I would say the same thing as he did. You know, it's having an open mind. I mean, it's there's a lot of stuff you can learn out of textbook, but there's a lot of stuff you can just learn being out there in the field with the customer, with the tenant, and I think like they put it in the, you know, previous statements, develop a partnership with them, develop a relationship with them, and you know, if they see the everyday struggle that we go through, they might think twice about it.
Great point. Great point. Tim, I'll give you the last word on this question.
Well, I think we've kind of touched on it, and everybody's touched on it, but just having that agency person have an understanding, and I'm going to quote Lynn Hunsinger one last time, when drought conditions hit, forage conditions are below average, and water conditions are such that we don't have stock water, you can't just put a cow on a shelf. These agencies want grazing, thankfully, but they've got to understand that making business decisions with a short notice to remove the cattle or lighten up the cattle or something, you can't just put them on a shelf and use them when you need them.
I think that's a really good point to end on. Thank you very much, Tim. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you especially to our panelists. It was great to have your expertise and experience on this topic. I learned a lot, and I think everybody else did as well. Please join us in 2 weeks on Wednesday, July 29th. We'll have our last in our drought series, really looking at drought impacts in targeted grazing operations. So getting to some of the questions that you all raised today about focusing on vegetation management and field load reduction. With that, thank you all. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel within the next couple of days, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.